All right, we're at question 15 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Obviously, you can see there's a different background and right up in the camera. We had some technical difficulties on Sunday, and so I'm just gonna do an abbreviated version just to get it on there. And here it is. Let's see if you see me do that. It's because I'm not used to reaching around there like that. But here it is, question 15. What was the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created? And the answer is the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created was their eating the forbidden fruit. Now, there's always the question in sin, what is the first sin? I used the word on Sunday, primal sin, that term, as distinguished from original sin. I don't want to use the word original sin just yet because I don't want to get it confused with the way that we're going to be using that term in a more technical sense. And here, we're not asking, how did it happen? Or even when, because we've already covered that. We're not prying into that mystery more than we've already tried to rule out things and deal with that. So here, we're really asking, what is the essence of sin? And that's more of what is sin. There is overlap in these questions. But when I ask what is the essence of sin, and what is the primal sin, what is its root or its DNA, I'm going to use that phrase, I'm really asking what is it that makes sin so sinful? So we've got this outline. I thought I had this is where we're going today. We're going to talk about sin on the surface, and I'm going to have a picture of that apple, which we don't even know if it was an apple, which I'll talk about. And then we're going to go under the surface, and if we have time, we'll talk about what that DNA of sin, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But here's Packer. He's talking about the Puritans. What is the Puritan view of sin? Because they, in a sense, had a high view of sin, and by that they took it seriously. And you know that if you've read anything by the Puritans. But here's what he says. He says, they saw sin as a perverted energy within people that enslaves them to God-defying, self-gratifying behavior, and by distraction, deceit, and direct opposition, weakens and overthrows their purposes of righteousness. So that's a sense of where we're going and why we're going there. This question that we're asking, what was sin? The goal here is not to be impertinent and to ask what Adam should have never asked, which is, well, give me a reason before I do this. Of course, we don't have any record of him saying that, but what did he say? What was he thinking? Maybe that's a good way to put all this. What were they thinking? That's often a good way of getting at what we mean here. This is, just to give you another quote, W.G.T. Shedd. I don't have this one on there, but it says, the first sin was unique in respect to the statute broken by it. The Eden commandment was confined to Eden. It was never given before or since. And so, in a sense, when we talk about going under the surface to ask what the nature of this sin is, we are talking about something unique that was to Adam and Eve, but we're also talking about something to get it under the microscope that I think we'll see is always present, giving birth to any sin whatsoever. And that's the whole reason why we're going into this. So let's look first at primal sin on the surface. And as I said, there's that apple. And this may, for some, get into the distinction between what's called positive law versus natural law. When I speak of natural law, I'm speaking of the law of God in the nature of things. In other words, we see in our conscience, with our reason, moral objects that's inscribed, it's using figurative language in Romans 2:14 and 15, written on the heart. That means in conscience. So we have a moral stockpile of knowledge. Reason is, the way Aquinas would have put it, is getting in touch with, is conforming to, is discovering the moral nature of things, the law of God, the way Paul would have put it, what the law requires in the nature of things. That's what natural law actually is. I know it's been wrongly expressed in modern reform circles, as opposed to positive law, where you simply have law posited. In other words, it's a matter of will. In other words, as far as we're concerned, we don't know by looking at the nature of that thing, why that law is what it is. And a classic example of that is shellfish. You see that all the time. It's just an example. In other words, anything in the dietary laws, the ceremonial laws, where God is calling a thing unclean, and you're looking at that thing and saying, well, what makes it unclean? Is it because it crawls around and is creepy looking? It's in the sea? And for some people, they might think that's what it is. Other people might think, well, no, there's a reason for it. Those things, short of modern practices of sanitary, food and stuff like that, it is unclean. It'll make you sick and so forth. That's, possible what, it might be a part of what God had in mind secondarily, but that's not what we find in the Bible is God's reason. We see in Mark 7 and Acts 10 that Jesus, and then by extension, Peter had this revealed to him, that all food was intrinsically clean. That's not why it was declared unclean. That had to do with ceremonial uncleanness versus the holiness of God. We see that as if we're Bible students and we pay attention to that through the Bible. But in and of itself, there's a thing that God says, do this or don't do that, and we can't tell by the nature of that thing why. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because in the case of positive law, one of the implications of positive law is that you simply do it because God commanded it. Now, because we have natural law, that's not the whole show. But we do also have this thing called positive law, where it's not inherent in the nature of the thing, or at least as far as we're concerned. We can't tell from the nature of the thing why that thing is right and why its opposite is wrong. And so when we approach the apple here, first of all, we don't know if it was an apple. All we're told is it's a fruit. That comes from artist depictions and things like that from Genesis 3. But you see that in Genesis 2:16. There may be something of moral law or natural law in it, in the sense that he says, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden. So before the prohibition, there is this display of goodness. So there is something moral that we can understand in the utter difference between what Adam, or really what the serpent was selling him on, that you should be able to have this, versus the fact that God had already provided everything good that they could possibly need. So there is something very intelligible in that. But even if there wasn't, Adam had no right to further pry into this rationale. God had forbidden the thing, and that was enough. Now, as I said, the reason we're going into this is because now that sin has happened, we see the same DNA. We see the same substance of sin that is present every time we sin. Okay, so there can be a holy motive in looking into this, namely avoiding the sin that they sinned. By the way, another thing we're doing when we go under the surface, and I'm going to read from other authors, Augustine, Calvin, others, that basically say it's not sufficient to simply say, well, look at them touching the fruit. And I used that example last time of when you're teaching your kids, where's the sin? What is sin? You hit your sister. Where's the sin? Is it in her shoulder? No. Remember we went through that whole example. Is it in your fist? No. Well, is it in the arm motion? Well, no. Okay, well then trace it back to the heart. So, it's your heart. Okay, so it's that thing that pumps blood. That's what's evil. Well, no. You understand that we're talking about a spiritual thing. Okay, so when we trace things back like that, when we sort of hold up the x-ray of what is the sin, when we're doing that and talking about going under the surface beyond just them reaching out for the fruit, we're also not questioning the historicity of the fruit. We're saying that's an actual event, an actual fruit, an actual reaching out by Adam and Eve to taste the fruit. When the Catechism says that eating the forbidden fruit was the sin, it's showing us that surface. But of course, the Catechism is not claiming that eating fruit per se is a sin, or that this arm motion is a sin. So if that's silly, then you should get the same point that Augustine and Calvin, when I'll read the quotes in a second, are getting at. It is spoken about twice, two other times, other than the passages we've looked at in the New Testament. And in both cases, it's Paul First is 2 Corinthians 11:3, where he says, "But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." So your thoughts are being led away. Maybe that's what's going on. See, that's what we're doing. And then 1 Timothy 2:14, "And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So maybe it's being deceived. But of course, just committing error by itself, that's a mistake. That doesn't seem like a sin. Okay, so what is the sin? Well, Augustine said this. I promised these two quotations, and that's very small print, even if you were there originally. Augustine said, quote, "As long as you look for evil in the overt act itself, which can be seen, you are in difficulty." And Calvin adds to that, quote, "The common idea of sensual intemperance is childish. The sum and substance of all virtues could not consist in abstinence from a single fruit amid a general abundance of every delicacy that could be desired. The earth, with happy fertility, yielding not only abundance, but also endless variety. We must therefore look deeper than sensual intemperance." So, still on the surface, we could say, and these are usually the first things that are said, that the nature of the sin is disobedience. Or even slightly under the surface, you could say, well, no, behind that is disbelief. Disobedience is to God's command, basically, where disbelief is to God's word. And so you might think to yourself that one is deeper than the other. In other words, since all commands of God are words of God, but not all words of God are commands of God, well, then it might seem reasonable to conclude that disbelief is more to the root, more primal of a sin than disobedience. Because every time I disobey, I'm also disbelieving. But it doesn't follow that every time I disbelieve that I'm therefore disobeying, because it's not always in the form of a command. The problem, though, with that is that we're also obligated to believe every single word that God says. And so actually, we can't say that, because in a different sense, every time I disbelieve, I'm also disobeying. So that actually doesn't get us to the answer to our question. At any rate, Thomas Watson, the Puritan, notes how the serpent struck first at the weaker vessel, Eve, as an expert soldier strikes a city first at its weak point. So he says this was Satan's masterpiece to weaken her faith. And we could see that underneath Eve's being deceived was a weak grip on the promises of God. So disbelief will set you up for every manner of sin. But let's go under the surface to our second point. Under the surface. And for that, we're first going to look at this quotation by Robert Dabney, because he's going to give us our first candidate, and he's actually going to refute it. He's not going to accept this, and that is self-love. What is sin most primally? Well, one answer is it is self-love, or selfishness, we could say. Well, Dabney replies to this. He says, if all sin is resolved into self-love as its essence, then is not all self-love sinful? See what he's saying so far. First premise. If that's true, that the root of sin, in other words, in every sin, is self-love, well then, every time I see self-love, there I will see sin, right? So Dabney says, well, if you answer no, then I reply, so there is a sinful and a righteous self-love. He must say yes. Then I demand that he shall give me the differentiating element in the sinful self-love, which makes it, unlike the other self-love, morally evil. What is he doing? He's driving under the surface to say, okay, well then what is it about the sinful self-love that makes self-love the primal sin? Dabney says, will he give me self-love for this differentiating element? This is but moving in a circle. Okay, so the moment you acknowledge that there is such a thing as a righteous care of the self, well then right at that moment you've undercut the case that self-love could be the very root essence of all sin. Well, given the awful reality of sin and its consequences, we might as well say, and that's the one you see at the bottom there, you might as well say that self-loathing is that same sin just as much as self-love, because sin can only destroy the self, whereas holiness can only improve the self. So in every act of sinful selfishness is actually a self-hatred, because you're destroying your soul. So what I have on this chart here is that same apple, but now it's blurred to the background, and they have these cross sections. And don't make too much of the layers here. All it's trying to show is some diagram of what's at the core versus, but all of these are under the surface. You could put them in any order. We're just putting them up there to list them. But that's that first one at the bottom, self-love. Well, along these same lines, you could say, well, maybe sin is unreasonableness or irrationality. Certainly we can say that all sin is irrational. But how so? Well, the larger catechism, question 24, builds on our previous question, which was question 14 in the shorter, and that is that sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. So the larger catechism is saying the same thing about what is sin, but now it adds these words. It says, given as a rule to the reasonable creature. Okay, so God's law and God's holiness are thoroughly reasonable, and he's communicating that to rational creatures. We mentioned that reason per se, when we talked about the image of God, that reason, the reason in a person, is part of the essential image of God. So everywhere I see an image of God, there I will see reason, one way or another. Now, here's the difference, though, with the fall. The proper functioning of reason has a new relationship to sin, okay? So reason will still be functioning, but because of sin, it will not be functioning properly. And part of what we want to say about sin is that sin is irrational. And that doesn't mean that reason is not called into conspiracy against God's glory. Sin is rational in the sense that sinful man's rational faculties are working. When I sin, my reason will be called into the act. But this will not be proper function of reason. This will be a perversion of reason. Reason will be perverting itself, bringing in false evidence, looking for observations of things that are out of context in order to justify the sin. And so we can say that sin is irrational in that reason is rejecting proper reason. The way W.G.T. Shedd says it is, sin is the divorce of will from reason. So you might remember that Jonathan Edwards, who Shedd leans back on a lot, defined the will as the mind choosing. So Shedd is saying that sin is the divorce of will from reason. So I'm choosing, my reason is still acting against the law of reason. You know, everywhere it's saying what is not. It is saying that I'm going to act for the self, but actually it's acting against the self. Okay, so sin is irrational. But there's problems with that too. That doesn't really get us down. Why is reason acting even against itself? Well, there's another candidate. Some in the early church did seem to be influenced by that Gnostic assumption about the body that we talked about, spirit good, matter bad, that whole thing. And it was suggested by some that the root of all sin was actually the sexual nature of the first couple. So I'm sure you've heard that before, that is what caused that reason. And that even affects interpretation of verses like Psalm 51, 5, I think it is. Maybe it's 3, verse 5, somewhere in there. But Psalm 51, where David says that in sin did my mother conceive me. And people look at, well, what's that? Well, no, it's not that. It's not talking about the manner of David or the psalmist being brought into the world. It is talking about him being a sinner from birth and that he comes from a sinful line. We'll get a chance to talk about that more, but that's rooted back in the Garden of Eden. And this view is often laid at the feet of Augustine. Now, Augustine does call this sin or this nature of sin lust. He uses that word, but he defines that word differently than we tend to in the modern world. He defines it as, quote, the love of those things which a man can lose against his will. The love of those things that a man can lose against his will. Well, what falls into that category? And the answer is obviously anything but God. God alone is that good that is unchangeable and eternal. And so anything else, theoretically, all things being equal, if God does not sustain them, can be lost. Okay, and so to desire that thing as an end in itself would be to desire a corruptible thing, a changing thing, and so forth. Okay, and so that is how he's using that word. Shedd argues that this is the actual full sense of the Westminster Standards, namely by lusting after and eating the forbidden fruit. That's the way Shedd is interpreting this answer, that reaching out to that fruit was sort of a lusting after that fruit. And he points back to Genesis 3:6 in the woman seeing and desiring over the fruit. In other words, these authors are using the word lust as something of a synonym for covetousness. Remember the 10th commandment. You will not covet anything. But see, it's not just anything that belongs to your neighbor. It's anything that God has not given to you. And so Paul calls covetousness in Colossians 3:5. He says covetousness, which is idolatry. One implication of that, and we'll get to that when we get to the law, is that anytime you break the 10th commandment, you're actually also breaking the first commandment. See, because in having an inordinate desire, a desire for something that God has not given you, whatever it is, and it can even be a good thing out of time or out of place. Something that could be in God's will, but you don't know if it's in God's will for you tomorrow or today or in that manner or in that amount or whatever. When you reach out for that thing and must have it regardless of God's will, well then you're not just having a desire for something, but you in fact are putting that thing above God, and you're also breaking the first commandment in breaking the 10th. Shedd hints in this direction as well, and we'll look at this quote. He says, Adam was not created with a desire for that knowledge of good and evil, which would make him like the gods, that is, like Satan and his angels. Such a kind of knowledge as this is falsehood, not truth, and to desire it is wrong and sinful. You shall not covet is a command that prohibits such a species of desire. So in other words, what Shedd is saying is that what we find in the 10th commandment much later on at Mount Sinai is an expression of the opposite of what that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, actually represented. To desire something which is only belonging to God. The early church spoke of what is called concupiscence. Now, this is the one that I don't have up there on my chart. I don't have that, but you could put it, it doesn't matter where you put it, but you could put it between that word lust and then the word we're going to talk about, pride. And we're not going to talk about this in terms of how this word settled into Roman Catholic theology. Something of a lesser sin. We talked about that last time, the not being versus doing. We're not going to talk about concupiscence in that way, but in a more basic and general way, the way it was used in the earliest centuries. This idea of concupiscence is a desire, or the old thinkers would have used the word an appetite. And it's kind of like when you think of appetite, you go in for food, it's a craving for some physical, in the case of food, to satisfy that physical craving. But the idea that this was a desire that the lower part of your being, so it does sound Gnostic at first, but there's a way to say it that's not. Paul talks like this, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the body, okay? And so classical thinking was not just off in a cloudy, Gnostic land. And speaking of this, it was any desire of the flesh or the body that is contrary to reason. And here we're speaking of right reason. John of Damascus gave the most concise and the most widely accepted definition of this, where he said that this is the irrational part of the soul, passive and appetitive. So again, think of cravings, of the body. It's not to say that your body is bad. It's to say that, one part of you is the caboose and the other's the engine. The caboose isn't bad, but it doesn't drive the train. And in the same way, reason is supposed to have a kind of mastery over the body. Well, here in this idea of concupiscence, irrationality and sensuality come together in a way that would have been familiar to Greek thinkers. And they weren't wrong as far as it goes. So, for example, Plato, in one of his dialogues, compares the soul, or compares the human being, to a chariot with its horses and its rider. And the rider of the chariot represented reason. And there was these two horses, and the breakdown doesn't matter right now, but really the horses in this sense, generally speaking, represented the lower parts, the passions. Horses weren't bad, can't drive the chariot without it. But the rider has to drive the horses, not the horses driving the rider. So hopefully you get the idea there. And to that extent, we would agree with the Greek thinkers on that. But having said that, the main candidate, and you see it at the center there, the main candidate that has been offered is pride. And let's go to Calvin again, who is going to agree a little bit, but then he'll go back to the text of Scripture. He says, quote, Augustine indeed is not far off the mark when he says, in his commentary on the Psalms, when he says that pride was the beginning of all evil, because had not man's ambition carried him higher than he was permitted, he might have continued in his first estate. Now, Calvin goes on there again to point back to the text of Genesis to show how disobedience was the primal sin that's worth talking about. But really, what's worth talking about, hopefully you can see by this graph, really depends on the task at hand. Don't pit these against each other. These are all there. It's probably a more holistic way of looking at this, that disobedience and disbelief and all that. Now, Dabney, just to take one example, I think it was Dabney, it was either him or Shedd, they were taking exception to the Catholic authors, probably Dabney it was, who made it about pride rather than disobedience to the word. There, I think you have a typical Reformed pushback to those who would focus on some moral virtue that could still be set right versus, the place of God's word. I don't know if that was all that was driving Dabney there, but I would just say that don't pit any of these against each other. Understand what they are in your diagnosis of sin. The final section here is this DNA. You see that DNA strand, and just those four, they're not the proteins. In fact, it's not even an exhaustive list necessarily. But what I want to say is that anywhere you see sin, you'll see these four things. Now, Bavinck, if you read him, might seem to be disagreeing with us here because he says that sin is religious, not moral. But I think it's instructive to note that Bavinck is pushing back against what he called the ethical theologians of the 19th century, those following Kant in theology, following Schleiermacher and others, that had reduced everything in religion, they had reduced everything in theology to ethics, to, in other words, temporal morality. How religion could speak to the things in our culture, how it could help us with a social gospel. So because they had reduced religion to that, Bavinck is pushing back against that with his criticism. I would suggest, though, that as you step back from the trees of the 19th century to the forest of the whole of theology, a more total pushback to the Enlightenment would actually be to restore morality to its more fundamental place within religion, within theology. And in all of these considerations, we bring things back to John's simple declaration that sin is lawlessness in 1 John 3:4. So we want to say that sin is legal and moral, but again, moral is going to be brought back into the theological context. So first, sin is legal. What do we mean by that? Real briefly on these. Well, sin is legal because God is the ruler of all things. He is the rightful king. And no matter where we go, we are in his kingdom. And therefore, we are under his law in all that we did. We saw that last time, that idea of trespass, that everything is his property. So when the Bible says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, as Romans 3:23 says, we can be sure that sin is no innocent mistake. And there's no such thing as a little sin. Okay, sin is legal. It is lawlessness. But secondly, sin is also moral. And think of the context of holiness and purity when you think about that, because holiness, among other things, is a moral attribute. It's not just the transcendence of God, his being wholly other, which is true, but it's also his purity. And so 1 John 1:5, think of that verse, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And so in this sense, sin is like darkness or corruption or pollution. It's a moral pollution. Sin is violating the holiness of God in the way of defilement or uncleanness. You read back in Leviticus, and there you have a whole book really showing us the effects of sin and the need to be cleansed in all of the different ceremonies. You know, think of all the things that the Jews had to be cleansed from, whether it was touching dead bodies or their own blood or that of others, sickness, disease, distortion of the body. All of these things were signs of that uncleanness and how sin destroys and corrupts everything in the world. Where Isaiah 64:6 says that even all of our righteousness is like a polluted garment. And in both of those things, the fact that sin is legal and moral, we can come to this third thing, that sin is personal. Because behind these considerations of the order of sin's operation and the real root of sin's nature, you have a more fundamental positive. And this is important in apologetics too. When you talk about moral arguments, what justifies morality? How can you say that? Who gets to decide? All these different things. Is that at the end of the day, the only thing that can make sense of moral obligation for me or for a group of people in society is that there is an infinite person. That there's a person to whom you're obligated. If I say, well, why do you have to do that? And you say, well, I have this piece of paper. Well, what's that piece of paper? Well, I have this obligation. To whom? To that guy. Who's he? Why is an obligation obligatory? What is its moral weight? Okay, so what is it that sin ultimately violates? That's maybe another way to say, what is the sinfulness of sin? What's so bad about it? What has it violated? Well, there's a passage in James that helps us. It gives us a clue. It's James 2:10. And I think we've quoted it already for one purpose, but I think there's something else there that we tend to gloss over. Where it says, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. In other words, there's a he behind the commandments. If you've ever asked yourself, what is James talking about? I see that he's saying that if I violate one point, then I'm guilty of all of it. But does he really mean that literally, that I violated the whole thing? I don't see his rationale. Well, he actually tells you his rationale if you look carefully. He says, for he. In other words, the universal behind all of the specific particular commandments is that in each of them, we are doing those things, upholding life, upholding marriage, upholding property, upholding my neighbor's good name, upholding those things that God has given me in his law, that he's given my neighbor, that I'm not to covet. So you take all of those commandments in the second table of the law. What is being upheld there? You say, well, the image of God. And that's right. What's the image of God? It's what a human being says about God. And so the universal behind all the particular commandments is God himself. For he, there's a person behind the commandments. And ultimately, even as you violate the image of God, you're actually violating God. Because you are to do what you do in those circumstances with the image of God because of what it says about God. But there's a last one. Sin is legal, sin is moral, sin is personal, but fourthly, sin is infinite. Because I said, well, why should you obey that contract? And you say, well, I'm obligated. What are you obligated to? Well, I'm obligated to that guy. And I asked you, well, who's he? Well, suppose he's just a janitor, just an engineer, And you could even raise the stakes, just a movie star, just a king, just a president. But at the end of the day, those are also finite reference points. The only thing that'll be sufficient for an obligation that holds over all moral actors is an infinite person, a person of infinite worth and infinite excellence. And so Watson explains that first sin in this way. He says, quote, "The sin was against an infinite God. It was malum complexum, a voluminous sin. There were many twisted things together in it. As Cicero says of parricide, he who is guilty of it," and he gives his Latin, but all they're trying to say here is, and this is before they had the language of DNA, packed into the genotype of sin was the phenotype of all sins. So the traits in the entire body politic, except in the whole history of the world, if you trace it back to the first sin, you will see in the first sin all other sin at the quote-unquote DNA level. And so he's quoting Cicero to say, even a pagan gets this, that he who commits many sins in one sin. So there were many sins in the sin of Adam. It was a big-bellied sin, a chain with many links. So that's Watson. But what he's saying is this, and we'll close with this. A person of infinite worth has been dishonored whenever we violate any of his commandments. And that's why no matter how trivial a wicked deed might seem to us, and Watson actually makes this point in another one of his books, that, Judas's sin was so terrible. Yes, but at least he did it for 30 pieces of silver. You do it for, and then Watson, compare a second of pleasure or whatever else. And so the smaller a sin is, quote unquote, actually the bigger it is, because you thought it was worth it to trade in the glory of Christ for this little scrap off the table. But regardless, no matter how trivial a wicked deed might seem to us, in reality, it deserves the wrath and curse of God. Sin defames God, distorts the soul, and destroys the world. By the way, that's important to know when you see sin's remedy. What is the gospel fixing? Well, what are we saved from? Well, we want to say the wrath of God. Primally, yes. And in that, all these other problems. Because if sin defames God, distorts the soul, and destroys the world, well, then the gospel remedy is going to fix all of those. But in covering God's glory in exchange for sin's fleeting pleasures, what we do is we hide from our souls and we hide from other souls what will truly satisfy us. And so we starve the soul in every sin. In every sin, there is murder as well as idolatry. And that, a mass murder, because we're covering from other souls who see our life the glory of God that their souls were made for. And so we're starving their souls. Sin is never a victimless crime. So with that, we'll wait till next time, and we'll get, in the next 2 to 3 questions in the Catechism, we'll start to unpack sin's effects now that we've covered sin's nature.